You're watching another edition of News in Depth, where we round up some more topical issues in the news cycle. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. The United States has released a new national security strategy that outlines a major change in its approach to Europe. The document moves away from NATO's long-standing open-door policy while calling on European allies to take greater responsibility for their own defense. What could this mean for Poland, NATO, and regional security? Joining us now is Adam Jasser, our news director at TVP World. Hello and welcome.
Hello, thank you.
So we're taking a look at this new document, and of course a lot of emotions has been stirred up. And well, I'm wondering whether this move to have treating NATO expansion no longer in the interest of Washington, whether or not it's a recalibration, or are we seeing a very big strategical pivot?
Well, in some sense, this could be expected because America's opposition to extending allowing Ukraine to join NATO has been known. Yeah. And it seems that it's also being agreed with Moscow. So that's one thing. But it's one thing to use that during the peace negotiations or any other negotiations around Ukraine. And it's another to put it on paper as a proposal for NATO strategy and to basically do away with NATO's approach of open doors to countries that qualify, that meet the criteria. So in other words, the US is trying to curtail the ability of sovereign nations to choose their own destiny.
Right, you brought up a very good point when it comes to the timing. Of course, writing this document right now and just on the verge of this discussion with Moscow raises a lot of questions. And we do have somebody from former Polish foreign minister talking about just that. Let's take a look.
The timing of the statement announcing that the United States would not expand NATO is tied to the talks that took place in Russia between Witkoff and Kushner on one side and Putin and Ushakov on the other. This is apparently the result of an agreement between the American and Russian delegations. The issue of Moldova and other countries that are not part of the alliance is a valid question to raise. However, that question has already been answered by the Americans.
Do you think we're essentially entering an era of more bilateral sort of security cooperation? And do you think NATO and this kind of, the Washington's reluctance to have Ukraine becoming a part of it signals sort of a weakness in the alliance as a whole?
I think the important point to stress that this national strategy identifies Europe, of all places, as a place which actually is run contrary to US interests. Europe is singled out as a continent, as an organization, the European Union, which is malfunctioning, and that the Americans want all kind of Eurosceptic and rebellious forces in Europe to change it. At the same time, the same strategy says that the US is interested in having strong Europe. So the question arises, how do they want a stronger Europe that could be a reliable ally to the United States if it's supposed to fragment and undo the European Union? So it's surprising to see with such clarity that the US identifies Europe as a problem. And there are some, really exotic accusations that, European governments lack legitimacy, that they are minority governments not supported by majorities of their constituents. Where do they get that?
All right. Well, yeah, you mentioned the Americans kind of push for this Euroscepticism, and I'm also curious whether or not this would work well or essentially backfire. We're seeing a lot of the more Eurosceptic parties or politicians point to U.S. as the alternative strategic ally as opposed to the European Union. But then with U.S. taking essentially a step back from European defense, how does that bode well for these people that are trying to prop up, saying that, well, we're taking a step back, but you guys should rely less on Europeans, but more on us?
That's a very good question, Ben, because this is inconsistent. So first inconsistency is that we want stronger Europe, but we want Europe to be more divided. How does that work? And then the second is exactly what you pointed at, which is you know, how can U.S. disengage from Europe and at the same time insist that Europe needs to change? It's just, I think this strategy shows inconsistency, but I think where it is consistent with the Trump administration's approach to Europe from the very beginning of this term, where, you know, J.D. Vance in this infamous Munich speech laid out all the grievances against the European Union, and the European Union is particularly of interest in this document, and the accusation in that. There is an accusation in that document that the European Union is preventing Europe from becoming stronger. And I would like to dwell on that point because in some sense you could argue that it's a valid point because maybe the European Union has become too bureaucratic. Maybe it has become, too much focus on other priorities than, let's say, security. But the answer to that is in that strategy, that Europe needs more sovereignty by individual nations and that the nation state should be the foundation of stronger Europe, is a contradiction in terms. Because if you want stronger Europe, the fragmentation is not going to serve it well. So and Europe has gone through periods of nation states, rivalry and all of that, and it usually ended in a war in which the United States twice in the previous century had to be drawn into. So there are lots of inconsistencies. And the really peculiar thing is that Trump seems to be saying to European parties that want to dismantle the EU or sometimes even favor direct exit from the European Union, that they are the future and that they welcome their sort of growing power. So there is contradiction, but there is also some consistency that Europe is some kind of a obsession. And maybe it's also the context. This strategy says explicitly that European leaders get Ukraine wrong. So that their support for Ukraine and trying to help Ukraine win the war with Russia is not realistic. That the realistic approach is to seek peace as quickly as possible and sort of allow Russia to come back, let's say, to doing business with not just US, but with Europe. That's the implication.
All right, you brought up US Vice President J.D. Vance and his kind of attitude towards Europe kind of also echoes what you mentioned earlier about wanting Ukraine to just go back to business as usual with Russia, which, of course, from our perspective looking at it does sound a little bit tone deaf because of there's a various reason of why the war came to be. But do you think that their approach towards Europe, their approach towards Ukraine is being seen as kind of a microcosm of understanding within kind of the American perspective, which fails to kind of take all these historical contexts into consideration? Or do you think it's more of a strategic push for whatever they're planning to, how to kind of realign the global powers?
Could be a little bit of both. There may be a certain absence of historical knowledge and focusing on wrong things, so to speak. But there is also a strategic concept there, because the thrust of that strategy is saying we want to focus on Western Hemisphere, right? So the return of the so-called Monroe Doctrine, which is America stays where it is. We don't want to be involved in other continents' affairs, which is a legitimate orientation. But as part of that, the strategy acknowledges that it will need some allies. So, for example, today we just heard from our service that a new command for the Arctic and Norway and so parts of NATO, US wants to take command of that directly. So in a sense, the US is saying, you know, Europe, you need to sort out your things, and by the way, the European Union is bad. Where our vital national interest is, which is the Arctic, we're going to make separate arrangements with countries involved. So it's very much divide and rule when it comes to Europe, because in a sense, European fragmentation will leave Europe in a sense, forced to follow the US wherever the US wants to take it, without necessarily having any say on this.
Yeah, I think, and that's probably one reason why the Trump administration is so keen on this kind of bilateral relationship, because in a sense, when a much bigger country has a bilateral relationship with a much smaller one...
It's actually explicit in the strategy, where the strategy says, sorry, everybody, but the world affairs historically have been decided by big powers. And the smaller powers, sorry, they have to adjust. The interesting part, and this is another inconsistency, that at the same time the strategy lures Central and Eastern Europe, which only 30 years ago was able to reunite with the West, it sort of encourages the Central European nations to stand apart from the rest of Western Europe and forge a closer alliance with the United States, but based on US national interest. So, inconsistency and contradiction, because how can you treat seriously such a commitment if at the same time the US ambassador to Poland, for example, says, there's no sentiment here, it's only business for the US. So in other words, you buy our arms, then we may be interested in helping you. How does this fit into NATO? How does that fit into broader European security framework? That's not clear.
Right. And speaking of the Monroe Doctrine, we also do have some of the extracts from this piece of document. Let's take a look.
The days of the United States propping up the entire world order like Atlas are over. We count among our many allies and partners dozens of wealthy, sophisticated nations that must assume primary responsibility for their regions and contribute far more to our collective defense.
So setting aside some of the...
That's sensible. These are not the controversial quotes contained in the strategy. This is actually what Trump has been saying to Europeans consistently. He's been saying Europe needs to take greater responsibility, needs to spend more on its own defense, and so on and so forth. But the really surprising thing is that the Europeans have been doing that now. They met all Trump's demands. They've increased spending on defense. They reached a trade agreement with him that some said Europe was, Europe's response to tariffs was weak, but Europe folded to sort of accommodate the US. So on every aspect of what Donald Trump expected of Europeans, they did it, just like that strategy just a moment ago said. But this strategy is also saying, well, that's not good enough for us because we also need to dismantle the European Union or change it so that it's no longer there. And that is the strange thing, that despite meeting his requests, the US is saying, well, we want more. And the really interesting thing is, and maybe that's something for people to really realize, that this radicalism is going further than during the Trump's first term and first administration, where Russia and China were identified as strategic challenges for the US. This strategy doesn't mention Russia as a strategic challenge. It mentions Europe as a challenge. That's really peculiar.
Right. And of course, I'm also wanting to put these inconsistencies aside and looking at Europe. What, at this point, should Europe be doing in order to be a counter to this type of narrative or take a more responsibility for its own defense to make sure that, well, it still has the sort of security that it needs?
It's very hard. I think it's very hard to say what Europe should be doing, because Europe is paying the price now for over-dependence on the United States for too long. And, again, Trump has a fair point where he says, Europe was free-riding on US security guarantees. It made itself dependent on Russian energy, and it neglected some issues such as growth, economic prosperity, and concentrated on goals which were ambitious and probably right, but sort of ignored the real threats. And so it's very hard for Europe now to catch up, given all the bureaucratic limitations. Look at this issue of using the
frozen Russian assets
as a guarantee for a loan to Ukraine. One country can block this. Remember how Hungary was blocking all other measures. So, in a sense, the European Union is becoming dysfunctional, And in a sense, Trump is taking advantage of this functionality. The trouble is that his medicine is likely to create even more dysfunction in the European Union. So it's easy to break something apart, but it's harder to sort of face the consequences.
Right. It's always a lot easier to point out the issue within the system than really to figure out how to build it back up. And
yes, but if you follow this trend, if this trend continues, and indeed some of these Eurosceptic parties gain power, we may see a period where the entire European project accidentally unravels, just unravels completely. And then it's going to be a mess that sooner or later is going to also impact America's security.
Right. We mentioned, of course, this is this essentially a Trump doctrine, and not just a Trump doctrine, but it's almost exclusively to this term as opposed to his first term. Do you think that this is going to be the same direction that the Washington takes going forward, or this is a uniquely kind of MAGA phenomenon?
Consecutive US presidents were warning Europe to take responsibility. The Democrats and some of the previous Republican presidents were saying it politely, but they were ignored. So Trump is doing it his way. He's blunt, he's direct, he's not beating around the bush. He's saying it loud. The trouble is that the Europeans started accommodating him, but it seems it's not enough. So he seems to be ready to sacrifice not just Ukraine, but also European security as such, and then pick and choose allies and play them against one another. So to me, this looks like a big risk for Europe, and I'm not entirely sure that Europe at this stage is able to formulate an answer to this. And I think that partly explains the silence with which the officialdom in Europe received this particular strategy.
Right, so we are perhaps actually looking at a very pivotal point in history, and we'll have to see how this develops. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight and breaking all of this down. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.
And thank you for tuning into this edition of News in Depth. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.